We are witnessing a rising tide of anti-Asian assaults happening across the United States.
I'm George Eli Herrera, and this is Voice of Our Community.
On March 16, 2021, a 21-year-old Caucasian male killed 8 people at 3 spas in Atlanta, 6 of whom were Asian women. In addition, we are seeing multiple counts of attacks on our elderly Asian community. Assaults range from being pushed, spit on, people are being called Chinese virus or told to go back to China, even though they are American citizens. At this point, the Asian community is living in terror, afraid to leave their homes, not only because of the pandemic, but also out of fear of being verbally or physically assaulted. My wife is Chinese. It is heartbreaking for my family and I to continue to witness more and more Asians being assaulted. The Asian American community, most of whom are hardworking and humble people, who constantly and silently bear the weight of discrimination. They tend to move on, turning the other cheek, instead of engaging with conflict. Somehow, this community is being portrayed as a disease, enemies, and less than human. America has a long history of discrimination on Asian Americans. In 1942, during World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt established Japanese internment camps through his Executive Order 9066. From 1942 to 1945, people of Japanese descent, including Japanese Americans, were mass incarcerated. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act suspended Chinese immigration for 10 years and declared Chinese immigrants ineligible for naturalization. This was a direct result of Americans on the West Coast blaming Chinese workers for declining wages and an economic distress, despite the fact that Chinese composed of only 0.002% of the nation's population. In 2020, President Trump repeatedly called COVID-19 the Kung flu and the China virus, intentionally pivoting the country's frustrations from the incompetence of their administration on controlling the pandemic. Elected officials and the right-wing media are continuing to serve as a catalyst in the spread of anti-Asian racism around the United States. There have been nearly 3,800 known hate incidents against Asian Americans reported since March of 2020. Racism offers the temptation to blame the weak rather than the powerful. Today, America relies on Asian countries for cheap commodities that help Americans live out the American dream. Our country then turns around and blames the Asians for the loss of American jobs. However, the underlying issue is caused by corporate greed, big companies seeking to maximize profit at the expense of American jobs. To acknowledge this reality is far too complex for many Americans, who resort on blaming Asians as a simpler answer. Politicians must stand against these giant corporations and work together to pass legislation to create jobs and impose higher taxes on big corporations. Every person in our nation deserves to live their lives with safety, dignity, and respect. Our community would no longer put up with this type of behavior and the endless bigotry in our country. Yes, our country. They say go back to your country. But what does that really mean? My ancestors were native to this country that we so dearly call the United States. One of the scientific theories speculate that they migrated here from Asia. Go back to your country. This is a bold and senseless statement to make. This land was stolen from our Native American ancestors in a cruel and vicious way. This country has shown its evil face once too many times and has deep-rooted hate in many parts of the country. I turn on the television constantly seeing our two parties fighting against each other. We cannot even find common ground on something as sensitive as racism. They turn a blind eye and pretend nothing is wrong. Under the First Amendment, hate speech can be criminalized when it directly incites imminent criminal activity or consists of specific threats of violence targeted against a person or a group. All this hate must stop, and our government's leadership must be held accountable for their words and actions that have propelled all these issues to escalate and spiral out of control. America is broken, but I continue to have faith that Americans will stand strong together, united to combat racially charged domestic terrorism. This is the time to check our country. If we are going to be a country that will withstand the challenges of time, we must focus on building a strong foundation so that we can build up, not down. If you really think about it, our republic has a short history. We are a fairly new nation with only over 200 years of history. Will we learn from our mistakes and move on as one country? Or will our republic meet its demise and perish? Be on the right side of history and stand up against any type of hate. Say no to racism and discrimination. Stop Asian hate. If you see something, say something by reporting these acts to your local police department. To my Asian community that stood up, we stand together with you, and we are not going anywhere until we get justice, are treated with respect and dignity.